Diolch yn fawr iawn. I need to click OK. Yes, I am willing for this to be recorded. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Elen Haf. Am gwahoddiad ag am y geiriau caredig. And I'm giving this seminar in English, and it's an opportunity for me to introduce work in progress. And just in case you are thinking, like one of my colleagues, that the centre didn't their work properly because India is crossed out and Africa is there, it is part of the lecture. Indeed, it's one of the foci of the lecture, or of the seminar, on Eisteddfod competitions in Empire 1819 to 1853. I have to give a trigger warning. There may be, or no, there is some offensive language in some of the material, and some of the content is violent. So I have to give you a trigger warning. Right, and this is when the slides don't move on because we've had them too open too long. Ellen, this is there. Now it's moved on. Yes, it has moved on. Right, for those of you who are not all that familiar with the Eisteddfod and the Gorsedd, and I know some of my colleagues from Cardiff are not, the Eisteddfod is between 1176, when the first Eisteddfod is recorded, and 1567, when the last medieval Eisteddfod was held under license from Queen Elizabeth I. It was an aristocratic and royal event, really to license court poets and storytellers and keep the rabble, those lower poets and storytellers, out of the courts of the great and mighty. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Eisteddfodau were then held as folk competitions in inns and taverns, to the chagrin of the intellectuals, but of course it kept the bardic networks and the literary networks of Wales and between Wales and London going, and it left us with a lot of poetry and cultural products from that time. So it certainly makes us happy, even if it didn't make the Morris brothers happy. Now, in 1789, and following the French Revolution of 1789, the Eisteddfod was reinvented, and it was followed in 1792 by the Gorsedd, which was invented by a man called Iolo Morgannwg. Both were envisaged as radical, democratic, national institutions, following, of course, and under the influence of the French Revolution of 1789. And we see that in the first topics, 4 essays in their essay and poetry competitions. For instance, in 1790, the topic was Rhyddid, or liberty, even though the results weren't quite what the London Gweneddigion Society had envisaged when they set the topic. At the Gorseddau, which Iolo Morgannwg held, and which are now part of the Eisteddfod, poems such as the Ode on Converting a Sword into a pruning hook were recited, and they were radical until they were suppressed about 1799. And you can read that poetry and material in the publications of the Wales and the French Revolution series, especially in those volumes I have there. And I work a lot with the Welsh poetry and with the English poetry with my students. Now, once the war had started in 1793, and that war, of course, with France lasted until 1815, and once Pitt's reign of terror, Pitt's legislation started biting in Wales as in other parts of Britain, those radical institutions either disappeared or they went into some kind of internal emigration and de-radicalized themselves. The Eisteddfod de-radicalized or became very British patriotic. The Gorsedd, as I said, was repressed. When both institutions were resurrected, and indeed, when they were combined in 1819, the world had changed. And they, in order to survive, they had to de-radicalize, they had to depoliticize. There was a takeover from what we call yr hen bersoniau llengar, the old literary parsons, from new industrialists and from the gentry who bankrolled these Eisteddfodau and the gorseddau. And the literature, which the historiography on this largely analyzes these processes. It tells the history of gorsedd and Eisteddfod, and it focuses on the outward appearance of especially the gorsedd, the paraphernalia that were invented, and how the kind of institution grew externally. So, you know, that's what my volume focused on, and that legacy. Marion Constantine's volume focused on Iolo's forgeries, how he did that. And the volume, to be perfectly honest, I go back to most these days is Catherine Charnel White's volume, because it says national, regional, and personal identity on the title page, but you actually find a lot of the material on which Iolo drew in the volume. So, and that is, for my current research, is quite important. Those people who have engaged with empire and the Eisteddfod have either looked at the second half of the 19th century, or they on the second half of the 19th century, or they have just looked at the language, like, for instance, Paul O'Leary. So, why do I have Cymreigyddion, the Abergavenny Cymreigyddion Society, in my on my title slide and my title? Because Cymreigyddion were the society which is responsible for the survival of the Eisteddfod as a Welsh-speaking, sorry, I'll just admit Marered, as a Welsh-speaking institution. They reintroduced the Welsh language and kind of converted the Eisteddfodau of the 1820s and 1830s from what had become very English medium and music festivals back. They drew them back to the Welsh language and competitions in Welsh. Now, the focus of the historiography here is very much on this, on them as an expression of Welsh culture, of a folk culture, on the international visitors and connections. That's what I have focused on, but not with a post-colonial lens as such, and on the visual culture and the outward splendor. And that starts with Maxwell Fraser's articles on Augusta and Benjamin Hall, the main sponsors of the Cymreigyddion Eisteddfodau. And you have an overview on her articles in the entries on Augusta and Benjamin Hall in the Dictionary of Welsh Biography, which you find on the National Library of Wales website. Now, when about 2 years ago, I was invited by Rebecca Thomas to contribute to a festschrift for Hugh Price, one of our major 21st century historians. When I was invited to contribute, I was wondering what to write about. I knew Hugh and we were both interested in the overlap between Celticity and medievalism, but I also knew that Hugh was interested in Eisteddfod competitions. So I had another look at through Eisteddfod competitions of the first half of the 19th century, and became very interested in them as tools of cultural and social engineering. In the absence of a university, the Eisteddfod was very much a people's university. So I ended up writing a chapter called The Enlightened Crowd with Grateful Rapture's Glow, History Setting Norms and Victorian Modernity in Eisteddfod Competitions 1815 to 1855. And today's talk is partly based on this and on other empire aspects of the Eisteddfod movement on which I'm working. So we're going to look at some Eisteddfod essays. We're going to look at adjudications and self-corrections. We're going to look at Eisteddfod poetry. For more comments and more on prize monies and druids, you're going to have to read the Festschrift chapter. And this book, Memory and Nation, Writing the History of Wales, is coming out at Cardiff University of Wales Press in Cardiff in 2025. For each kind of aspect, I'll choose a couple of case studies from the material, which is very, very rich. And we start with essays, and in 1819, and with the Eisteddfod, which saw Gorsedd and Eisteddfod firmly linked, but also firmly de-radicalized, as Iolo Morgannwg shook hands publicly with Thomas Burgess, the Anglican Archbishop of Wales. Now, among the essay competitions was one called Language and Learning in Britain under the Roman government. And the winning entry by John Jones, the Reverend John Jones, in almost Hegelian terms, remarks on the dialectics of historical processes, affirmed the benefits of subsequent invasions and conquests of Wales. The conquest of the Celtic tribes on what is now Welsh territory by the Roman Empire had helped the Welsh on their way to civilization. So John Jones wrote, an inquiry into the origin of nations leads us to investigate the nature and extent of those causes which act upon the mass of population, and to produce those revolutions from which various systems of political societies arise. Under the influence of certain fixed habits and fundamental maxims of social order, there seems to be an ultimatum beyond which society cannot advance, a barrier which nothing but a change of habits introduced from accidental circumstances or resulting from the contingencies of war can remove. There is a climax in the scale of civilization at which a nation may continue stationary for ages, till interrupted by the inroads of a more powerful invader, or induced to adopt new maxims of internal policy or ambition. Foreign intercourse is generally productive of such changes. Of war, they are the inevitable result. The Welsh then had benefited from being conquered by the Romans and incorporated in that empire. It had been the catalyst the stagnant Celtic civilization needed. And this essay, like many others, was published in 1822, 3 years later. The essay on historical accounts of the Flintshire castles submitted by Gwlad Garwr, and this is the first time that a bardic pseudonym will come up. Gwlad Garwr means patriot. So what kind of patriot do we have here? We ask ourselves. So this essay, submitted to the 1828 Rhyddlan Eisteddfod, takes the reader through a lengthy inventory of internecine medieval strife, which only ends with the Acts of Union with England, when instead of precarious liberty, they now began to enjoy solid and permanent freedom, secured by equal and fixed laws and established under one august monarch. Incorporation into another kingdom once again had saved the Welsh. After this, Wales's happy subaltern status in this union is further demonstrated by a lengthy roll call of Welshmen who had contributed to empire, from inventive lawgiver Dyfnwal Moelmead, one of Iolo's inventions, to early modern entrepreneur and MP Sir Hugh Middleton, and Tudor descended King George IV, or so he was described. The apex of its line of illustrious Welsh imperialists was Orientalist William Jones, an Oesite who left his own country for the benefit of millions of his fellow creatures in a distant climate. The distant climate, of course, was what was then called East India, and he died in Calcutta. They all contributed to empire building in a subaltern position, making the empire great again. As I said, we have to be sparing with examples. Successful and now much better remembered antiquaries and historians from Angharad Llwyd, a fi'n gweld bod Fion yma, hello, to Thomas Price, Carnhiannog, presented similar interpretations of the Welsh distant and medieval past. Many of these essays were published, which means they influenced those who bought them or borrowed them from one of the new libraries, discussed them in the educational societies connected with those libraries, especially in the industrial areas and in chapel societies. Now let's move from the published to the unpublished, because for me, working with unpublished and undigitized manuscripts is one of the most delightful aspects of being a historian. Scrutinizing unpublished submissions of work in manuscript before it is published reveals even more unintended information than published material, such as for the Eisteddfod competitions, the ingenious ways in which bardic names were concealed or not by flapped over page corners and artful squiggles. We learn about adjudicators' feelings, but most importantly, we learn how social and cultural norms were imposed through adjudicators' glosses and authors' self-corrections. The man, a very famous historian, who was adjudicator for most of the historical essays of the Abergavenny Cymreigyddion for 2 decades, was Thomas Price Carnhiannog, who could be severe and usually used red ink, as you can see here. Crossing things out, sometimes he just wrote rhyfer, too short, but very often he combined criticism of content with criticism of style. The author of an 1834 essay on the coming of Christianity to Great Britain, for instance, was excoriated as follows. So much of this essay has been taken out of Hora Britanniae and translated word for word, that it should be called a synopsis of this valuable work rather than an essay of the work of its writer. And I need to say some of my translations are working translations because this is work in progress. So forgive me if they are sometimes they don't flow very well yet. So norms of scholarship were imposed by these adjudications. This is clear, and it's connected with politics, with more social norms in other cases. For instance, Carnhiannog's judgment on the 1835 essay, Hanes Bywyd Llywelyn Tywysog Diweddar Cymru, The Life of Llywelyn, late Prince of Wales, reminds us that historical treatments were acceptable only as long as they adhered to an accepted political framework and were objective. Here, Carnhiannog notes, there are too many irrelevant comments in this essay. Much of it greater resembles a speech, and the author discusses here his own private feelings too much. These kinds of comments do not throw any light on the history, but rather fill up unnecessarily. Oh, I'm trying to... oh, there it is. Sometimes the slides won't move on. Carnhiannog's disciple, Thomas Stevens, was spared excoriation in the margins of his 1844 essay on the evils arising from the destruction of salmon when full of spawn. He argued for, in this essay, for the traditional or natural right of the Welsh to fish their rivers for the salmon that was too expensive for them to buy. He was scolded privately for his acerbity of expression and for the attack on the magistracy, for siding with the poor, because strictly speaking, as you can see here, they can have no right to fish. Poverty implies an absence of property, and the right to fishery is a property. This was, as so often, combined with comments on style. The correct political direction went hand in hand with the right, polite way of expressing oneself. Carnianaug wrote that I perceive a great difference betwixt the tone of the salmon essay and that of the heraldic poetry. In the last, there is nothing whatever of acerbity of expression, and I thought you left off much too soon, whereas in the other I wished every sentence to be the last, and never turned a leaf without dreading to meet in the next page some explosion of angry feeling. The prize was not awarded to Thomas Stephens, even though Carnianaug privately admitted that he had the highest regards for Thomas Stephens's abilities. Those who did not stay within the bounds of what was accepted politically lost out literally, because the prize money was quite substantial. This was the ideal way of steering a nation, the education of a nation, in the right direction. You just did not award those who were too radical with any enumeration. Right, let's turn from adjudication to the perhaps resulting self-correction, which allows us an even more direct route into the mind of these authors and poets. And this is where the title of my paper comes from. In 1841, the Swansea Derwyddon Society, and Derwyddon means Druid, advertised an essay competition on the question whether the Druids sacrificed human beings, which elicited a number of interesting entries you may read about in the chapter, and they are quite interesting. Suffice here to consider one passage from the 49-page essay submitted by Senex. Senex discounted Caesar's account of continental Druidic sacrifices in wicker cages as war propaganda, probably correctly, while Tacitus's narrative on the conquest of Druidic Anglesey struck Senex as fiction. Most interesting, though, are his self-corrections, the sources he indicates, and his comparison with Druidic society. And here I need to give you the trigger warning. And let's unpack the three passages I have circled here. Senex writes about things that do not happen often in civilized societies, adding, and even in the Indian desert wilds of India, struck out twice Africa. What is contrasted here is civilized society and uncivilized societies. And it doesn't matter whether it is India or Africa, the contrast is there between Europe and everybody outside Europe, the British colonies, or what was kind of hoped would become British colonies. And he's probably crossed out India because his secondary source, his reading, had been Barrow's travels in southern Africa. And what had he read there? He writes about the pleasing character struck through portrait have we of the chief of a tribe. His countenance is heavily marked with a habit of reflection, vigorous in his mental and amicable in his personal qualities. Geika was at once the friend and ruler of a happy people who universal pronounced his name with transport and blessed his seat with felicity. Barrow's travels in southern Africa. Quite a pleasant description of the chief of an African tribe. He interprets this chief, and Senex has radical leanings. In the end of this passage, might not this chief crossed out because mustn't repeat oneself, but also this is a noble savage, an uncivilized noble savage, isn't he? Might not the savage be held up as a lesson to European monarchs, as an instant of the effects of true morality, a portrait of a state to which the Druids might have and did attain by the ease of the great knowledge they possessed? For wherever true knowledge exists, it becomes at once an object of admiration and conduces to the happiness of its possessor and his companions, as Virgil informs us. Now, of course, he cannot but boast a little with his knowledge of classical antiquity, very valued at the time. But what's important here is, of course, that he equates the head of a tribe in Africa in the 19th century with Druidic society 2,000 years earlier. So geopolitical and chronological contrasts and meshings are here combined. Now, to write the essay, Senex had drunk deep from the fount of imperial knowledge. It always takes me a while to switch the slides. I have no idea why. There we go. The Barrow he cites are the 2 volumes of John Barrow, an account of travels into the interior of southern Africa in the years 1797, 1798, including sketches of the physical and moral characters of the various tribes surrounding the settlement of the Cape of Good Hope. And Barrow's description was part of the British colonial contestation of South Africa. Geika is the European rendering of Nika, the much described head of the Hausa, whose lands were then described as the lands of the Kafirs or Kafirs in 19th century colonial literature. And you can see that at the bottom there on the map. And this map was in John Barrow's account. Now, I will give you a very short passage, different passage from the book, which is really offensive. So I want to warn you about that, just to illustrate what Senex was reading for his essay on the Druids. And this is a passage, this is from the chapter Sketches of a Journey into the Country of the Kafirs, and describes their society and their women. They are said to be exceedingly prolific, that twins are almost as frequent as single births, and that it is no uncommon thing for a woman to have 3 at a time. Their children soon after birth are suffered to crawl about perfectly naked, and at 6 or 7 months they're able to run, and so on. So this is a people described as akin to the kind of word of animals, where children kind of start crawling soon after they are born, no education is needed, and they run around like foals. Deeply offensive, and the source of Senex's essay, or one of the sources of Senex's essay on the Druids, so deeply influenced by imperial thinking and literature. Now, by 1841, of course, the Abergavenny Cymreigyddion had long started holding their Eisteddfod members, safeguarding the Welsh language and its culture by gathering Welsh manuscripts and books and awarding prizes for Welsh essays and poetry on a wide range of subjects. all the time trying to avoid any political or religious partisanship that would have smacked of disloyalty to empire or radicalism. Now, when the Slavery Abolition Act came into force on 1st of August 1834, releasing over 800,000 slaves in the Caribbean, Canada, and South Africa into so-called apprenticeships of up to 4 years, it was deemed acceptable to announce a competition to celebrate this event, because surely this was a reason to celebrate king, government, and empire. Now, the abolition had been greeted with some trepidation in the press, and that includes the Welsh press. Trepidation which was indicative of colonial attitudes of European superiority and Christian civilization. A sermon, for instance, preached by the Reverend Mansell and Monmouth and reported in the Monmouthshire Guardian, highlighted hopes that so important an event may be blessed of God, of course, and that all evils which might be feared from so great a change may be prevented. The international news section of the widely read Baptist periodical Seren Gomer reported with relief that almost everywhere the momentous event had passed without much disturbance, however great the fear that was cultivated on this account. In Antigua, everything carried on quietly, and I translate, as if slaves had never been on the island. So they had just, their history had just disappeared. Now, in the year that followed, the Abergavenny Cymreigyddion advertised as a main topic and a competition on 12 neu ragor o englynion ar ddiddymiad y ceithwasanaeth neu groaidd trefedigaethol Prydain ar y cyntaf o Awst 1834. So 12 or more englynion on the abolition of the imperial British enslavement of black people on the 1st of August 1834. A record number of 16 poets followed the call, of which, however, 8 were disqualified because they hadn't franked their entries. The winner was Siôn Chwarae Teg, that is young Thomas Powell of Dowlais in industrial South Wales, and his englynion are rightly jubilant. And I'll show you the first verses in translation. Now, Siôn Chwarae Teg, his englynion won because I suspect they were the most abstract. There is very little suffering in there. They celebrated liberty in quite an abstract way. For instance, verses 3 and 4 read in my translation, "O liberty, your gifts, your heavenly and choice blessings, release more than a happy return, the many talents of 1,000 men." Verse 4, "Hail the day of the abolition of slavery, a precious and quiet enjoyment. 100,000 stand and praise it, and from their heart are singing." Especially in verse 4, we note the same signs of relief, by the way. This is precious and quiet enjoyment, and the 100,000 who stand and sing surely are singing hymns. So this is the same relief we find in the press. Now, returning for a quick detour to the joys of Eisteddfod manuscripts, not all entries were as good as Thomas Powell's. Caswallon, for instance, was not considered worthy of any praise. The adjudicator noted that the poet wrote ysgrifen law hynod, gwell ysgrifen na synnwyr, So an amazing hand, as you can see, but better writing than sense. As I say, in the manuscripts, the entries are of a very, very varying quality. However, whether they were worthy of prizes or not, overall, what we have in the Englynion in here are, the 8 accepted, and there they are. We have Anjanedd Byreolwg. This is a scientist, a short-sighted scientist, and I can assure you the handwriting was really like that. The entries we have featured fewer references to the sons of Ham and to the Jubilee than I had expected, judging on other, on analyses of anti-slavery campaigning. And they all celebrated they celebrated and praised William IV and British efforts, distancing the Welsh and the British from atrocities, and there was very little remembrance of the very long anti-slavery campaigns which had led to the legislation abolishing slavery in the British Empire. Howard, for instance, and again, these are my translations, writes, "Oh, the rough practice of the oppressors who sailed to hunt Africans. So pained was the mien of the men, the horror of such merchants. People like cattle they bought, without a grain of morality, to the ship with them to lock them in strong evil bonds." Cymro or Coventry, a Welshman from Coventry, wrote Caethion dan estron feistriaid o Ewrop, slaves under foreign masters from Europe. Nowhere in any of the poem is any connection made with Great Britain with reference to British or Welsh people as slave traders or enslavers. The British government and other, British and Welsh people are on the right side. They're disconnected from the suffering, and indeed they are to be praised for ending the slave trade. And that's the only time England, Britain, William IV come up in these poems. Cymro or Coventry again focuses on William IV. Excellent England freed them cheerfully, William IV, and his chosen advisors, who are men renowned through all the countries. Llynos Gwen focuses on the Parliament. Our exceedingly generous Parliament and just remembered the slaves. Their shackles to joyful blessings were unbound from their robes. The most striking example of a simultaneous distancing and from the atrocities and focusing on British saviours were the Englynion and extensive footnotes with graphic descriptions of violence. So there's another trigger warning by Howard, the Baptist preacher David Saunders. An English footnote cites the Reverend Eustace Carey, and who in his tour through South Wales in the year 1833 stated that one poor woman, confined and concealed in a week, had a large nail forced to one of her eyes. Also, many other ill treatments were related by the good old man. The passage is framed by Carey at the top and ends with Carey, the good old man. The focus ultimately is on him as a savior rather than on the suffering of the enslaved. And the extensive Welsh footnote, equipped with English translations of unfamiliar words, you can see in this slide, the suffering is countered and relieved by British agents enforcing British law. When the enslaved were loaded onto ships by pirates, they were locked into chains. They received the pitiful and hard treatment After the law forbade this work, smuggling was practiced. They were locked up in hogsheads, etc., to hide them from the king's officers. The buyers would rush towards them, the others ready to sell, provided they were paid enough. It was suffered that the closest relatives were separated, the men sad, the children sold in the same way. This is the greatest hardship for the parents. They got scarce food and were flogged often, and awful scars of this work. Remember, this is a working translation. Thanks is to the government for freeing them, and therefore the poor and the rich, above all, thanks to the government. We should all do so tumultuously and wholeheartedly. So the focus is very closely on British legislation, on British officers as saviours, and on giving praise to government. It is not on any anti-slavery campaigns or on the enslaved. I move to my last case study for today, and we move from the West Indies and the slave trade to what was then known as East India. A part of the empire with Wales had a slightly different relationship. A good example showcasing that difference are the speeches, visual material, and poetry that accompanied and emerged from the visits of two leading Indian businessmen to Wales in 1842 and 1845, especially the visit of Dwarkanath Thakur or Dwarkanath Tagore in 1845. Tagore, a British educated lawyer in Calcutta, had first visited Britain in 1842 and engendered much interest, if not obsession, at that time. Queen Victoria received him and remarked in her diary on 8th of July 1842 that the Brahmin speaks English remarkably well and is a very intelligent, interesting man. And the slight note of surprise in that diary entry says it all, I think. The Court and Ton column of the Illustrated London News carried extensive footage on Tagore. I mean, it's like the paparazzi of today, honest. And for instance, reported on the bust you can see there, which was commissioned and made of him. Lady Augusta Hall, Lady Llanover. Llanover was very, very keen to get Tagore to the Cymreigyddion Eisteddfod, to Abergavenny. And in 1842, she only got his nephew, but in 1845, he visited a year before his death. And I've written about this visit in the Olion article, but kind of not under a post-colonial lens. I'm looking at transnational connections there. So, of course, it almost goes without saying that his visit was honoured with a competition to compose a series of englynion on him, which attracted 10 competitors who sent in their work on ymweliad Sir Dwarkanath Tagore ac Eisteddfod y Fenni Hydref y Pymthegfed a'r Unfed a'r Bymtheg 1845. The visit of Sir Dwarkanath Tagore to the Abergavenny Eisteddfod, October 15th and 16th, 1845. The joint winners were Hirgoes, Gwargan a Gwyneb Lloyd, that is Ieuan Gwynedd or Evan Jones, a religious minister from Tredigga, and William Gellideg, a coal miner from Merthyr Tydfil. So all sorts of people competed in these Eisteddfodau. There was an English entry by a man called a lover of the bards, and I've not found out who that is. We will turn to that at the end. Now, one connecting link between all the englynion produced on this occasion is the joy of experiencing a united empire in person through the visit of Tagore. We have another gwladgarwr, patriot, who's jubilant that we are getting our country more than any and India to true unity. Gael ein gwlad yn anadeb ar India I wir undeb. Gwion bach, little Gwion, links this with a common praise for the young Queen Victoria, whom the Welsh loved so much that they claimed she was of Welsh descent. From India, across the Pacific, came a man, wise, magnificent, and amiable, to see us of tender heart and his great esteem in our land. To the heavens we subjects shout, to our gracious, blessed Victoria. For the lovely peace, let's have a jubilation across the length of the Indian continent. And of course, Victoria's armies and the East India Company's armies were at that very time, spreading peace right across the Indian continent. Only on the entry of Bardd Cloth, the lame bard, did the adjudicator note, rather angrily, nid yw yn dywysog, he is not a prince. And I think this was an expression of his displeasure with the poetry and the poet, rather than a true expression of what he thought, because all the poets had orientalized Tagore, this hard-boiled businessman who'd kind of opened the first coal mines in India, founded the first Anglo-Indian business, and was trying to wrest the opium trade from the Chinese. So all of them had actually cast Tagore as a prince. And Amagus, a man of high birth, blessed with that kind of particular blend of Eastern wisdom. So Hiergoes wrote o randir y fawr, India y doethwr a deithiodd. Yma, we can translate that as sage Amagus from the great Indian continent. The sage traveled here. Bladgarwr, patriot, wrote that the profound, learned and good, the elect Prince of India from overseas came to this land. But this was a wisdom, a civilization which had long been superseded by the West. It was an ancient, declining culture. And Tagore's visit would benefit his country on his return. As we see, as Bardd Cloth writes, y Loeffler Himalaya a gwiodeg dysgeidiaeth o walia. The Himalaya will be enlightened by the proper or useful learning from Gwalia. Indian civilization had long spent itself, superseded by the West. Bu urddas gynt yw beirddio'n, nos hir o dristwch drostynd hwy a'i brodyr. Her poets once enjoyed an exalted honor. A long night of sadness came over them and their brothers, in the words of Hiergoes, the winning entry. Now, the long English poem contributed by a lover of the bards, which which inserts the English language into this most Welsh of competitions, and which inhabits a space somewhere between the late 18th century romantic depictions of the last bard, whose death signals the end of Celtic culture, and maybe J.R.R. Tolkien is perhaps most representative of this Orientalism, of this contrast between West and East, a culture and the ascent, and a culture whose halcyon days are long over. And I read out this poem, and don't blame me. A lover of the bards wrote that in 1845. Prince of that far-famed, dear and distant shore, where once was throned the Magus and his law, whose throne, though crumbled, fallen to decay, a purple twilight tells of sunken day, or the last lingering solitary ray shed on the mountain's lone and loftiest peak, unto the enraptured gazer's soul doth streak. Of vanished splendor, glory that is past, visions of bygone greatness round us and art, the melancholy wrecks around us strewn, that tells the majesty, the might that's flown. If aught of mine could to the soul impart a deeper feeling of a Briton's heart, I bid thee welcome to our seeker's isle, on strange, though poor and weak, yet void of guile, welcome to Cumbria's halls and mountain land. Cumbria, even though the strains of her harps are poor and weak, is still superior to that culture which has long passed its halcyon days. Right, so why does this matter? Cultural historians like me are sometimes accused by some colleagues of leaving out the people, of only focusing on the cultural products, looking at the texts, the symbols, the maps, the sculptures. Well, not quite, because it is people who produce what is left behind under the influence of ideologies, and of course their writings, their maps, their sculptures, their poetry influence others. Senex was, as some of you may have suspected, Thomas Stevens of Merthyr Tydfil, then a young man who would become a very well-known and influential social reformer and pioneering historian in industrial Wales, and who was also one of the co-founders and the secretary of the public library, so controlled what other people would read and get to read. And they boasted that they kept that public library free of radical literature. Thomas Powell, the winner of the Englynion on the abolition of slavery and empire in 1835, was a young poet from industrial Dowlais, again in South Wales, influenced by older men such as the Baptist minister David Saunders, whose focus was very, very firmly on government and white agency as saviors. Now, I will never know, perhaps, unless I really, really compare handwritings, who a lover of the bard was, but we know that the joint winners of the competition were Ieuan Gwynedd, or Evan Jones, author, editor, and minister from Cymreigyddion, the man who published the first short-lived periodical for Welsh women in the Welsh language, on the one hand, and on the other hand, William Morgan, a simple coal miner from Merthyr Tydfil, trying to better himself through that Welsh University of the People, the Eisteddfod movement. So what we have is influencers and influenced, all operating within the framework, kind of organized and financed and organized through finance of yr hen bersoniaid llengar, the old literary parsons, new industrialists and gentry such as Lady Augusta Hall and Lord Benjamin Hall, all operating within that framework which did not permit social radicalism and which did its very best to confirm that Wales was a proud part of the British Empire. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Marion.